Hello, everybody. Welcome back to Security in the 21st Century. I'm your host, Dr. Suzanne Loftus, and I have with me on the show today, Sam Charap from RAND. Hi, Sam. Thank you for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
So Sam Charap is a senior political scientist at the RAND Corporation. His research interests include the foreign policies of Russia and the former Soviet states, European and Eurasian regional security, and US-Russia deterrence, strategic stability, and arms control. So today's podcast will be centered around these major themes. So let's discuss the current war in Ukraine. The general consensus and general rhetoric has been that the war in Ukraine is also a broader fight to protect and defend the liberal world order and the rules-based international order. We also hear the rhetoric that this is a fight between democracy and autocracy. So do you agree with this line of thought? Why or why not?
So I guess there are really two questions. It's and even multiple dimensions of both. There's the question about what the stakes are in the Ukraine war in terms of global order. And then I guess there's the question about whether this is about democracy versus autocracy question. And in terms of the first, I'm of two minds. On the one hand, Russia annexed Crimea and sponsored an insurgency in eastern Ukraine, and then essentially invaded eastern Ukraine in 2014 and maintained that annexation and invasion for 8 years, and the world order didn't collapse. So I think there are ways in which challenges, norm violations can be, the implications of norm violations can be contained. That said, of course, this is a much more egregious violation of existing international norms, and certainly in its initial scope. So I think there are bigger global questions about whether states are allowed to get away with this kind of predation and the impact that that has on the future and other states' potential decision-making on similar issues. And the Russians themselves, including Putin, last week said that this, that the war, or as they call it there, the special military operation, marked the beginning of the end of the America-centric international order. That's almost a quote. It's an odd place to mark the beginning of the end of the U.S.-led international order, in that it wasn't that the U.S. had security commitments of a direct kind with Ukraine. So I guess I certainly see the potentially significant implications for the international order of Russia's actions, but whether or not it marks the sort of could be the end of it. At least I think the jury's still out. But I think that's an important element of driving U.S. policy in all of this. That is the broader implications that go beyond Russia and Ukraine. I'm less enamored with the democracy versus autocracy framing. I don't see, Russia doesn't do autocracy promotion in the same way that we do democracy promotion, and is largely agnostic to the character of the regime of its neighbors. I think, and this isn't my framing, but like the issue is that the U.S. has is with certain autocracies, not autocracy period. And I think we're seeing that on display today with the president's visit to a country that could hardly be characterized as anything other than an autocracy in Saudi Arabia.
Well, thank you very much for your answers on those two, very important points, and to strengthen this debate around those issues, present kind of an alternative perspective there. And so what about Russia's own role in the post-Soviet space? How does it view its role and its responsibilities? Would you say that the way that it's treating and approaching Ukraine is the exception to its usual conduct, or is this common rhetoric again that Russia wants to reestablish the USSR or some former Russian empire, a just thing to say?
Certainly, Ukraine occupies a very particular place in Russian national security thinking. It's hard to overstate its importance to Russia and the Russian establishment and how they see potential challenges to their country's national security. Before this war, I would have said that there was that the imperialism framing obscured more than it illuminated. However, it's hard to make that case now. And I think, February 22nd does really mark, February 2022 does really mark a shift in how we should be thinking about the Russian leadership's willingness to use force to reassert its authority in the region. And I think that we should be prepared for the same kind of risk acceptance to be operative if similar things were to happen in Belarus. That's the main case in point, I would say. But beyond that, I think each of the other countries in the region, Russia's relations with them have become differentiated over time. Russia's relationship with, Azerbaijan is very different than the relationship with Georgia, than the relationship with Armenia, than with Moldova, and so on. So I think it really varies from country to country. And I wouldn't see a sort of grand plan of imperial reincorporation that goes across these countries uniformly. That's how I guess I would respond to that.
All right, well, thank you for that as well. We also have this very strong debate going on among analysts who have pointed the finger at Western policies for having exacerbated the relations between Russia and the West, and perhaps they were either too concessionary, according to some, or too provocative, according to others. And where would you position the role of the West in this?
Well, I think it's the framing of blame is not something that I feel I think it's the wrong framing. There's only one country that deserves blame for the decisions that were made in this year to launch this war of aggression, and we shouldn't lose sight of that. That said, there was and remains a sort of dynamic interaction between Russian policies and Western policies over the course of decades that led to the kind of breaking point initially that we saw in 2014, and where it obviously became much more acute in 2022. That's not to say that any Western policy bears responsibility for the outcome. I think it's just to note that Russian policies didn't emerge in a vacuum, and that there was some degree of interaction between Russian threat perceptions and the actions both of Russia's neighbors and of the United States and its allies in Europe.
So, throughout the course of this conflict, obviously, One's move is usually contingent upon the move made by the opponent. And so do you believe that Russia's original plan has shifted along the way? If so, what was the original intent and what has it evolved into being today?
Well, I think it seems pretty clear that Plan A was regime change, or something akin to the sort of march on Baghdad in 2003, where the assumptions about the Ukrainian military not putting up a fight and the Ukrainian leadership fleeing, and basically that the Russians military would be welcomed with open arms, and essentially any resistance would crumble. That obviously all of those were flawed assumptions. And I think once that reality set in, and it took like over a month, at the end of March, you saw a pretty significant shift in Russian war aims, whereby I think it's clear that an attempt at forcible regime change is likely off the table. And although I wouldn't rule out completely a return to more expansive war aims in the future, since early April, the focus has been much more on taking the Donbass, meanwhile also imposing a bunch of costs on Ukraine across the board. And the challenge is that the goals behind Plan B are not fully clear to me, and they seem to be shifting, or at least there's a bit of improvisation going on. It's hard to tell, and I think that is problematic, because this is obviously the most significant use of force that Moscow has undertaken since World War II, and it's unclear to what end exactly. If this were just about the Donbass, why are we seeing, incipient plans for an annexation of the Kherson and Zaporizhia regions? It just doesn't square with this is all about, liberating the Donbass, so to speak. So, I would say that there's a bit of strategic incoherence that emerged after Plan A failed. But they're certainly different war aims now. I'm not sure we have a good sense of what exactly they are, and maybe the Russian leadership itself doesn't.
In some of the articles that you write, you argue that reaching a compromise might be the best case scenario, and that the United States' goals could actually be better reached that way. How do you suppose that is, and how do you suggest the West should help resolve the impasse going on at the negotiations between Russia and Ukraine?
I think you're referring to two separate arguments I made. One was about whether it's in the U.S. interest to have this war go on, like as a long war in the U.S. interest, or our short-term interests, both in helping Ukraine and in our broader strategic interests, served by a war that ends sooner rather than later. And I made the case, and this was even in late March, that a long war, the longer this goes on, the more problems we're going to face. And I think that is actually, unfortunately played out accordingly. I think the challenges stemming from this war have grown, and it's unclear to me that Russia's in a worse position. It certainly occupies more of Ukraine now than it did at the end of March. Second question is what would be a sort of ideal outcome, best case scenario outcome for how the war ends. And I had a piece in Foreign Affairs, I guess it was at the beginning of June, on the Istanbul Communique, which was a document that the Ukrainian negotiators put forward during the last face-to-face meeting they had with Russians in Istanbul in the end of March. And I tried to analyze that document, and I think it has, obviously there are significant challenges associated with it, but it was as close as the parties themselves have come to outlining the parameters of a potential settlement. Obviously, a lot of water has passed under the bridge since then, but I haven't seen a more compelling vision for, how this ends in a way that is stable over the long term than what was outlined in that document. So I do think it's, it's worth calling attention to and considering going forward. Now, the question also you asked about what can the U.S. and the EU do now, given the fact that the Ukrainians and the Russians aren't really talking except about this sort of grain exports issue, which is a relatively narrow, relatively technical question. That's a tough one because both sides at the moment seem to prepared and to prefer, in fact, to fight it out. It's hard in that context for external actors to, alter that kind of a calculus. Now, we, the West, do have lots of leverage with both of these parties. And one way of thinking about how to get them to the table is exercising, leverage to that end. At the moment, I think the predominant view is that now is not the time. But my fear is that as time goes on, reaching anything more than a ceasefire will be difficult, more and more difficult. Obviously, a settlement would be extremely difficult now, but might become impossible in, if this goes on for however many more months.
Mm-hmm. And how do you see transatlantic unity throughout all this? Do you see them sticking together through the evolution of this conflict or war?
So I think it's fair to say that one of the policy successes has been the extent of transatlantic unity on these issues, and that the Biden administration has managed that quite skillfully. And one of the surprises is the extent to which the Europeans have been so forward-leaning on both, punishing Russia and assisting Ukraine, the Germans in particular. So the question is how sustainable is this consensus now that we see signs that the economic consequences of the measures imposed on Russia are going to be felt pretty significantly within Europe. And so I think and also, frankly, what you hear about European militaries reaching the end of their own stocks in terms of what they can supply to the Ukrainians. So, there's the question whether we've sort of reached peak unity or peak transatlantic effectiveness on all these measures. It's hard to say, but that peak must exist somewhere, and after that, it's going to become harder to maintain over time. But I don't think it's inevitable that it will crack. And with every Russian bombing of a urban area in Ukraine, I think they drives the transatlantic allies closer together, frankly. So, over time, I think there's gonna be far less friction when it comes to European security issues than there was before the war, because this has clarified the nature of the Russian threat to such a degree.
Mm-hmm. What about the role of information warfare throughout the war? Ukraine clearly has a very developed strategic communications campaign, but what is Russia doing on its end, and is it effective?
Very interesting aspect of all this, and sort of counterintuitive, because we were before all this so used to hearing about the superpowers of Russian disinformation and their capacity to control our minds. I'm exaggerating a bit, of course, but only a bit. The disinformation stuff got, I think, pretty out of whack. Hopefully this episode has punctured that balloon. in that we've seen, Russian information operations fail spectacularly. And it was almost as if they ceded the field to the Ukrainians early on, or at least once they had lost the advantage, never sought to regain it. I think, for me, this is one of the telltale signs about the extent of the compartmentalization of decision making on the war itself. It's clear that the folks in charge of information operations were not read in to this plan and had no time to prepare after the war began. And they ended up with these sort of improvised symbols like the task force markings on Russian, armored vehicles, which weren't even in Cyrillic, So I think most Russian IO since then, I think, has been focused domestically. We've seen some signs of attempts to work within Ukraine, but I haven't seen any widespread. Well, I mean, maybe at least I haven't seen any effective disinformation campaigns executed in the West.
Yeah, it's true that, we always heard how great they were at spreading, propaganda or influencing users on social media, but it seemed to be quite lacking in the beginning of the outbreak of the war, surprisingly. And so last question, do you see shifts in the future of the international order? Because some countries are refusing to condemn Russia's actions, such as China, and other very key economic actors, such as India. Are we seeing the beginning of a kind of separation between states and the global South and the rest of the world, or the West and the global South, or anything?
One interesting dynamic. So I think it's sort of too early to say. If our expectation was that the global South would sort of do our bidding, and when it came to this war, I think those were unrealistic expectations. So I'm not sure that this is a huge shift. One question that I'm going to be keeping an eye on is the extent to which Russia emerges from this dependent on China. Obviously, it's going to be more dependent on China. The question is how much more. And there's a range there that could, actually alter the international order, given how significant those two actors are, and also the nature of their relationship, at least up to date, where although they didn't go against each other, you didn't have them necessarily acting in unity on their respective, revanchist agendas. And there's a potential future in which Russia does not have the choice but to support China if it were to undertake something along those lines. So that's the kind of tectonic shift that could emerge from this war, in my view, that we should be concerned about.
Mm-hmm. Okay, great. Well, Sam, thank you so much for sharing your thoughts with us on this podcast, and it's been great hearing your perspectives.
Thank you so much for having me.
And to the audience, thank you so much for tuning back in to Security in the 21st Century.